One unique aspect about the hobby is that people always consider separate eras and scales to be unique. However, there are some cases when this may not be true or should not be followed. However, in this model Railcast video tip, I am going to show you how era and scale can successfully be mixed. First, let's start with era. In order to define era, I have two fairly typical trains right here, a diesel era and steam era train. First to the diesel era train. You can see that we have a relatively large diesel-electric high-nose locomotive, second generation likely. We also have a steel boxcar and a steel caboose. One thing that you must know is towards the end of the 80s and 90s, cabooses started to fade out of the picture. But for the most part, well into the 70s, cabooses were still there. Now in the steam era train, you can see here that you have a small 060 tank locomotive, small wooden passenger car, a small wooden boxcar, and then a short flat car. So the first thing that you can probably notice in the difference here is that all of the diesel era train is steel and most of the steam era train is wood. That was fairly characteristic. Another thing that you notice is that in the diesel era, there weren't any passenger cars. At this point, Amtrak had taken over in the 70s and 80s. Also, compare the boxcars. This one is a little bit longer and a little bit taller, while this one is shorter in both aspects. This is fairly characteristic of era change that you may notice. As the era got older, or more or closer to the present, things got longer and had more capacity. Also, you can notice in the locomotives that the steam era locomotive is relatively smaller. There were some large mainline railroads which did have considerably sized locomotives, but if you're modeling a branch line, you got 260s, 460s, what have you. A lot of smaller locomotives. So that's your basic era definition right there. Now let's say, in this situation, that a steam era train had these two cars added to it. You can easily tell right off the bat that these two cars are significantly older than the actual train itself. For example, this old water car was probably put out of service in the 1900s, the early 1900s. This bobber caboose also is considerably older, based upon its size. Now, this is where the mixing of the eras comes in. If you're modeling a small short line or branch line railroad, then it was not uncommon to see older equipment running on it, because they weren't rich enough to buy the necessary equipment. In this train, for example, you can easily imagine these two cars going down on a small branch line. On this same note, what about mixing scale? Look here, you can see this locomotive is fairly large and up front, but way off in the distance, you see this smaller locomotive. Now, how would you have known that this locomotive back here is N scale if I hadn't told you? You would have assumed that it was really, really far away. This is how you can bring forced perspective to your model railroad. Another tip from the Model Railcast show.